Started. All right, so today we're going to talk about quantum simulation, and quantum simulation is one of, in my biased opinion, most promising parts of quantum computing. And we're going to do a case study with quantum simulation on photosynthesis. Now, I know you might not think about quantum computing, even quantum mechanics, when you go outside and you look at a plant, but it turns out quantum mechanics is everywhere. And we're going to talk about how quantum mechanics enables photosynthesis and is sort of fundamental to life on Earth. And then we're going to talk a little bit about using quantum computing to simulate physics. So our learning objectives today, we want to recognize that you can simulate quantum computing with many classical methods, and they have their own strengths and weaknesses. And underneath that, we're going to talk about why you might even want to simulate a quantum computer with a classical computer, because as you might imagine, that simulation isn't really efficient because classical information and quantum information are different kinds of things. And then we want to recognize that quantum computers can be used to simulate physical effects far better than classical computers can. Okay, so with those two things, let's get started for today. All right, so quantum simulation. What is quantum simulation? Well, it refers to simulating one quantum system with a different system. And if you think about that, right, a simulation is often uses a different system to try to get at the results of some system of interest. So you might think about simulations for like aerodynamics in a wind tunnel, right? We're simulating a physical system with a computer system. Same kind of thing for quantum simulations. So the different system for quantum simulations, right, we can break those two things down into a couple of different forms. So one, we can simulate a quantum system with a classical computer. And before we had qubits in quantum computing, right, that's what we've been doing with any kind of simulation problem, right? With maybe some rare exceptions, but most of the time when you think about simulation, it's in a classical computer. Or you can do a simulation of a quantum system with a quantum computer. Okay, so we're going to think and talk about both of these different ways, why you might want to use one versus another in our lecture today. But the first one we're going to talk about is quantum simulation with a classical computer. Okay, so that brings us to sort of our first segment of our lecture, simulating quantum computing. Okay, so this entire course has been about sort of why you might want to do quantum computing. Quantum computing extends our computing power beyond the classical space. And so that this topic of discussion really suggests this question: why would you even want to simulate a quantum computer? If you can simulate a quantum computer, then why would you need to build one? Why do we worry so much about qubits and noise and all the stuff we've talked about? Well, there are a few reasons why this simulation might be important, useful, interesting. Okay, so in the near term, right, we don't have fault-tolerant quantum computers. We have to deal with all the dephasing, decoherence issues, right? Even our NISQ sets noisy intermediate scale quantum computing, the kind of near-term quantum computing stuff we can do today that we talked about a while ago, those aren't particularly accessible. And simulations can help us build and use fault-tolerant quantum computers. So until we get to a time when quantum computing is cheap and easy and accessible, right, then testing, understanding things about quantum computation might still have a role for classical simulation, right? Because not everybody can have a quantum computer in their garage, but lots of students in our Q by Q course can run Cirq and think about aspects of quantum computation that are going to help them understand quantum computers when we have more robust kinds of fault-tolerant quantum computation available. So in the long term, right, simulations can help us optimize use of quantum hardware. It may be the case that, quantum systems, quantum computers are always going to be these very large, technically demanding pieces of technology that are only available maybe in a university or a corporate private kind of setting. And so simulating these may be the right way to make them more accessible. Maybe you do a simulation of a small part of your problem on a classical computer before you take the big problem to an actual quantum computer. And this is actually kind of interesting, but quantum inspired algorithms, the more you simulate quantum computation, the more you think about quantum algorithms, there can be inspiration that influences classical algorithms from that. So there's a healthy sort of feedback there. So there's some reasons that we might want to simulate quantum computers, even on a classical computer. So with that motivation, let's ask ourselves, well, how would we do this? Because there are a few different ways. So how can we simulate quantum computing? Well, there are a few key approaches, key algorithms that we can use to simulate quantum computers. We've heard of some of these, right? So the state vector, right? Remember, we talked about several ways of visualizing quantum states. We had Braz-Ketz, we had we had our block sphere, and then we had a state vector. So a state vector, and this is sort of how I grew up as a physicist, right? We would encode our quantum information into some vector, which is some, column matrix. And then you think of the quantum computations, the transformations, as these square matrices that you apply. And so this is really the math of quantum mechanics, right? In some sense, this is more of an exact calculation than it is a simulation, right? Like I can technically do this with just a pencil and paper and did it as a graduate student. So this is a way to just use quantum physics and the math of quantum mechanics to figure out what happens in a quantum system. Okay, so what are the pros of this approach? Well, it's easy to implement. So matrices, linear algebra is honestly unreasonably effective, and it shows up everywhere. So, computer scientists and mathematicians have been working together to figure out how to make matrix calculations easier and more efficient for years. And so there's already a robust amount of information that can make that state vector simulation easy to implement. It's easy to interpret, right? You read off the results of the calculation, and that's your state vector. It produces exact results. So remember, I said this is kind of like, less of a simulation and a lot of a calculation, right? There's not a heuristic. It just gives you an exact result. Here are the cons, though. So it's big O, right? It's scaling is exponential. So every additional qubit you add increases the amount of classical information you have to store by a factor of 2, which sucks. That's one of the worst cases for computational complexity. That exactness that we're so excited about, that's so cool that you can get out of a state vector simulation. Well, if you have a noisy case, which we absolutely will, that exactness is lost. And so it's almost like you're paying a premium to get an exact result that you're not going to be able to realize physically anyway. And this type of calculation does not include any kind of randomness. So we have to put the randomness in on the back end. So it's cool because it's an exact calculation, but it's not the best because it doesn't scale well. So this works for like small scale kinds of things, but won't work for larger scale simulations. Okay, Monte Carlo simulations. Monte Carlo is actually a very cool technique, and if you're not familiar with it, it exploits random numbers and sort of some tests or some transformations that allow you to when you do a bunch of random simulations on average, you figure out the answer. So Monte Carlo is actually well suited to handling things with noise because it can automatically include the effects of noise in the calculation because there's some randomness to the process inherently. So pros and cons of Monte Carlo. The pros are it has that randomness built in. So some of the randomness that it comes with measurement, you don't have to add on the back end like you would with a state vector calculation. It's relatively efficient. And so what that means is instead of like the state vector calculation where it scales exponentially, you can get away with fewer calculations than the state vector. And it's versatile and it's useful, and Monte Carlo simulations show up all the time. I remember when I was a nuclear engineer, we used to use Monte Carlo simulations to calculate neutron radiation density inside of a reactor. So it like the matrix approach is just really well developed, and therefore is reasonable to think about implementing. Okay, the cons, exponential big O in some cases. So it scales better than the state vector, but the scaling, quite frankly, is always going to be a bit of an issue because we're taking a classical system and simulating a quantum system. And that's just, in general, a hard problem. And also, because Monte Carlo is random, you can think about, when you do a poll, thinking about which presidential candidate is in the lead, right? You need to have a lot of samples in your population, your sampling population, to be accurate. So unless you're running your simulation long enough or include enough data points, right, you may have some inaccuracies that show up. Because of this, right, there's no reason we have to use these things separately. So we might use some state vector calculations and some Monte Carlo calculations to simulate a quantum system together. Okay. So tensor networks. Now, tensors were kind of a scary word for me for a long time, and in some respects, they still are. You can think of them as these generalized forms of state vectors. So if you move from a vector to a matrix, that's going column matrix to a square matrix, that's like going from a vector to a tensor. And these tensors mathematically offer you some efficiencies that you can take advantage of. Tensors are interesting mathematical objects in their own right. They also show up in general relativity, and stress and strain and mechanical engineering. Like there are a lot of places. But here, you can think of them, like I said, of generalized matrices. And so they take the sort of magic of the state vector and make it a little bit more efficient. Okay, so what are our pros? Well, these are among some of the most efficient simulations to date. And they're typically very precise. And they're great for quantum systems that have a lot of degrees of freedom. So like large collections of electrons, which maybe we'll start to think about a little bit later today, actually. Okay. The cons, more challenging to understand the details. I have a book on tensor calculus. And man, is it tough? Like, so don't let that necessarily scare you away, but be aware that it is a more challenging approach. Nothing comes for free. So you get precision and efficiency, but it's hard to do. And it's not exact. So just like, the state vector simulation is exact and has no randomness, the Monte Carlo is not exact, but is more efficient. So the tensor thing is kind of in between there. And if you need to entangle things, which is important in quantum systems, particularly simulating quantum computing, it doesn't scale that well. Okay, and then this discrete event framework thinks about these quantum processes as sort of discrete events, for lack of a better term. So a state vector will, you can think about it as almost smashing all your gates together into one big matrix and then calculating that matrix effect on a state vector, right? This will do some things that happen in order. And so you can generate noise, entanglement, qubit, all that qubit communications that will happen over some amount of time in some discrete order. And so it's almost like, rather than trying to efficiently simulate the math, you use a little bit of intelligence and say, okay, maybe I can do some specialized computation here, where I can model these particular complex events in a simpler fashion and apply them in a certain order. Okay, so the pros of discrete event. So it's relatively efficient for large systems with many events. Okay, so you can think of large number of qubits, right? And lots of noise or decoherent events, in some sense. You can see sort of a time series type of emergence happen. So instead of applying everything at once like a state vector, right, you can get a sense of, by looking at your simulation at particular times, what happened and when and how the system changes. And it's particularly useful in quantum networking. Now, some of the cons, well, it can be complex to build realistic simulations, because now instead of having all the math done for you, you got to think about, okay, how and when and where do I model this particular dephasing, or how and when am I entangling these two qubits? You might need high-powered hardware for it. Frankly, I think that's probably true of all these things, but bears mentioning. And it doesn't handle continuously changing systems very well. Okay, so there's not a one size fits all for this simulation thing, right? It depends on your approach and what you're using these simulations for. And so maybe you really need to know exactly what's happening, because you are a quantum engineer trying to figure out a particular algorithm. And so it's okay that you only need to do it on 3 or 4 qubits, because that's all you need to prove it. And so maybe the state vector calculation is the best. Maybe on the other hand, you're a quantum engineer working for IBM and you really care about jacking your number of qubits up. And so maybe you want a Monte Carlo simulation, because there's no way you're ever going to have enough computing power to really efficiently tackle a large number of qubits. Okay, it also depends on the type of hardware you have access to, right? We think of classical computers and quantum as like almost one kind of thing, but there's actually a spectrum of classical computers, and you can take the idea of classical computation and create an architecture that's very efficient for particular types of problems. And so the hardware you have access to, the tools you have, can change what simulations will work for you and what simulations wouldn't. So let's think about the hardware, right? Simulating quantum mechanics is hard, frankly, and it's that exponential thing, right? Think about the number of states that you have access to every time you add a qubit. Every time you add a qubit, you double the number of states, right? That's the exponential origin of the big O complexity for our quantum simulations in some cases. So because simulating quantum mechanics is hard, you might want to use high-powered networks to do so. You might want to use some specialty type of hardware. So something that's not just the latest processor that came from Intel, but something designed really to address some of the challenging issues with quantum computing. GPUs and TPUs are an option. So graphics processing units and tensor processing units, right? These are specialized parts of computers, right? They're silicon chips that have been designed to tackle really hard parallelizable problems. And they're specialized for working with vectors, matrices, and tensors. It turns out that a lot of graphics calculations can be done with matrices. And so in order to do graphics, we built up this incredible architecture for matrices and parallelizable computations that happens to be really useful for quantum simulation and AI. Right? So those are some specialized pieces of hardware you can use. Maybe you just want a good old-fashioned supercomputer, or what we call high-performance computing systems, right? So these are, you think about really big, challenging simulations that need to be done on a network of dedicated processors, right? That are in some server room that is, climate controlled and water cooled, all this kind of intense stuff, right? High performance computing systems is just a supercomputer. And maybe those simulations will work out for you. And finally, right, maybe you just need a quantum system. Maybe the quantum hardware is going to be the best way to simulate your quantum system. So maybe you have one of these NP complete type problems that you've encoded into a quantum system, and then you can simulate it that way. Okay. So with that, I'm going to take a sip of tea and pause for some questions. And feel free to ask questions at any time. We've got Sanskriti here, who is a pro at answering them. Okay. Well, with that, let's move on to one of the most nostalgic parts of today's presentation for me. We're going to spend a good amount of time talking about photosynthesis today. And I know you might think, well, Dr. Derek, this is a biology course. No, this is not a biology course. This is a course on quantum computing. Why do we care about photosynthesis? Photosynthesis turns out to really be inherently quantum as we understand it today, which is crazy, right? You don't go outside and see a leaf and think about, oh, that's a quantum system, right? But it does depend a lot on quantum mechanics. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. So we're going to do a case study of photosynthesis as a way to think about why quantum stuff is important. Okay, so let's just refresh ourselves. What is photosynthesis? Well, photosynthesis in some respects is the basis of life on Earth. It's how, right, our ecosystem takes energy from the sun, puts it into plants, which can take the energy from the photons that the sun sends over and make it into sugars that show up in plants. And then it's a transformation of this radiant light energy into chemical energy, which is food. Another way, it's how plants eat, basically. And it has a lot of interesting aspects that are relevant in a broad cross-section of physical subjects, right? So photosynthesis and an understanding of photosynthesis contributes to a lot of different technologies and innovations. So solar energy is inspired by photosynthesis, right? The same process by which you can take a photon and sort of create an electron in a hole. We'll talk about what those are later, and turn that into electrical energy, right? That's photosynthesis. We happen to do that in silicon. Plants do it in carbon. Artificial photosynthesis, right, which is a way we can sort of more closely align ourselves with the process of a plant and generate energy that way. And biological energy technology. And this is sort of thinking more broadly about, moving out of an inorganic framework to an organic framework for creating harvesting energy, right? All of these things, the spectrum of, very much inorganic, complex metal oxide, semiconductor stuff, all the way to designed biological systems, right, owe themselves to a understanding of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, I mentioned, is kind of how plants eat. How does it actually work? Well, here's how we can think about photosynthesis. So pigments, right? Pigments, that's going to be a key word, are these molecules in leaves. that absorb light from the environment. So it's what makes leaves look green. Right? Chlorophyll, for example, if you've heard that word. There are lots of these pigment molecules in a leaf, as you might imagine. So for a leaf to look green, you have to have a lot of pigment in it. And we can think of these sort of arranged in some physical structure. So they're hanging out in the leaf. And now these pigment molecules are designed or have evolved such that when they're struck by light, so when a photon hits one of these pigment molecules, and a photon, remember, is just the quantization of light, it's a light particle, they can actually kick one of the electrons that's hanging out on this pigment molecule into a higher energy state. That higher energy state, we're going to call that an exciton. An exciton has a technical term, and we can get into that as necessary. But I want you to think of the light energy being transferred from the photon into this quantum system, right? That's the electron on the pigment molecule. So now that we've created this excitation in the pigment molecule, right? That excitation needs to travel to a reaction center in order to be turned into usable energy. And so you have a transfer of light energy into this exciton. If you can move the exciton, which carries the light energy, to the reaction center, then you can go through the process of creating chemical energy for the plant to use. So the exciton is actually like there are these what you might call light gathering antennae that exist in the leaf, right? And so all these different molecules of pigment, right, don't have their own reaction centers. So the energy in the exciton is going to travel along these pigment molecules. It can hop from one pigment molecule to another to get to a reaction center where it can actually be converted into this chemical energy. So maybe our exciton is hopping from pigment molecule 1 to 2, and then from 2 to 3. But keep in mind, right, the reaction, the exciton is just in some sense, one of the dumbest things you can imagine. It's a particle that carries energy. It has no idea where a reaction center is. All it knows is that it can follow sort of the contours of potential energy in the molecule it's in. It's just hopping randomly around until one of two things. One, it hits the reaction center, is converted into chemical energy. Or two, it loses its energy to some kind of vibration, turns it into heat, whatever. So the hope is that the exciton will get to the reaction center before it just dissipates. So maybe it makes a mistake, right? Maybe it gets lost, it hops backward. Okay, maybe it hops back to pigment 3. And then finally, it gets the reaction center, right? Okay, so this one made it. This one now, this exciton can have the energy it captured from the photon used to generate used to generate chemical energy. Okay, now I promise we're getting there. Just stick with me for a little while longer, because we're going to bring in the quantum soon, right? We can think about photosynthesis as something called a random walk. Now, random walk is this general framework for many problems, but it describes any problem where something is moving randomly, and it can lead to sort of random, unpredictable outcomes, right? So the exciton is moving randomly across these pigment molecules because it doesn't know any better, right? There's no a priori reason for it to travel one direction for another, so it just kind of picks one. The same way measurement in quantum mechanics kind of picks a state. Due to this randomness, right, random walks are often modeled using Monte Carlo methods. And so that throws us back to why Monte Carlo might be useful for simulations in general. So we have this right now theory about photosynthesis. And it's backed up by data. We understand excitons, we understand chlorophyll molecules, we understand actually how the exciton goes to the reaction center, how that generates chemical energy. Um, so let's take this theory and analyze it. What are the outcomes of this process going to be using a random walk, and see if it explains what we see in nature. Okay, this is kind of testing our theory. Really, what we're interested in is how long does it take for excitons to reach the reaction center? Because if it takes too long, remember, these excitons can dissipate themselves, right? And we won't have the opportunity to change our light energy into chemical energy. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some Python code. So let's look at this particular code. Okay, so we start with a few variables. Our reaction center is going to equal 4, and that's going to kind of be the low. That's going to be where it kind of is. The position is going to be where our exciton starts, and the steps, right, are going to be how many times it's moved pigment molecules. Right, so we initialize our exciton on pigment molecule number 1, and there are no steps. Right, so it's in position 1, hasn't taken any steps. And now let's look at this while loop. And this while loop says while the position doesn't equal the reaction center, right? So while the position doesn't equal where the reaction center is, what we're going to do is the following couple of steps. We're going to add some random plus or minus 1, right, to the position. So the position either goes up by 1 or down by 1 randomly. And we're going to increment the number of steps. Okay, so that line number 6, right, involves the exciton moving left or right. And it's random, right? We don't know whether it's going to move left, whether it's going to move right. But we know it's going to move. And then after that, we're going to say, okay, the step count is increased by 1. So you can see now that we executed line 6 once, and we added 1 to the position, and we added 1 to the steps. So we randomly move left or right each time. And so now we moved left because the random choice moved us left. And again, we incremented our steps by 1. So remember, we started no steps on position 1. Now we're at position 1, and we've taken 2 steps. So that's kind of the random nature, right? There's a priori no reason to move left or right. So you may end up back where you started. And we're going to just keep doing this until eventually the exciton is going to take enough steps in the right direction to get to the center, the reaction center. And then we're going to stop. And so we took 7 steps to get the reaction center. Think about that. You know, the exciton was only 2 or 3 steps away, but it took 7 steps. That's because of the random nature of this classical random walk, right? The electron or the exciton doesn't know which direction the reaction center is in, so it's just stumbling around blindly, randomly, until it gets to the reaction center. So each time we run this simulation, we get a different result, right? Maybe a particular simulation would have the exciton move in the same direction as many times as it needed to get to the reaction center, and it would be the most efficient possible. Maybe it would move in the wrong direction a whole bunch of times, and it would take it forever to get back. So if we want to have some idea of the dynamics of this system, of its critical properties, right, then we should run the simulation many times. And so maybe we run this a whole bunch. And so this code, right, this code, if we execute, will run a bunch of simulations. And it'll do the same thing a whole bunch of times. And then we can get some information at the end about the total number of steps required. So if you look to the right, here we've got the output of all these simulations. And you can see that some of them, you know, there was one simulation where it took 500 steps to get the reaction center. Others, it looked like it barely took any steps. So let's look at a typical value, right? Because a typical value is going to be what we see in nature. If you think about what's happening in nature, right, there's so many photons hitting our chlorophyll or pigment molecules, and there's so many pigment molecules that nature is going to effectively do this Monte Carlo simulation itself, and we're going to be looking at the results of that. So let's look at a typical value, because the typical value is what we're going to measure. That typical value in this case is about 22 steps. Okay, so much less than 500, but much more than 7. What if the reaction center is farther away? Well, now we can create a whole bunch of different locations for a reaction center, right? So we've done a whole bunch of reaction centers. We've done a whole bunch of simulations, and we can look at what comes out of that. So now we're looking on this plot on the right at the typical number of steps required to get to a reaction center versus the distance from a reaction center. And keep in mind, like, we've only done 100 simulations for each of these. So there's going to be some variance. Remember, the Monte Carlo simulation process inherently has some dependence on the sample size. So if you only do 100 simulations, it makes sense this doesn't look exactly like a straight line. Okay, so that's, you can sort of look at it and say, okay, you know, as I increase the distance from the reaction center, it's going to take me more steps. That kind of makes sense. So it turns out that this theory, despite how beautiful it is and like the coolness of a random walk, does not reflect reality. Our classical random walk says you're going to need thousands of steps, even if you're just a few pigment molecules away from reaction center. The reality is that yellow line, and it's almost hard to tell. Like, the yellow line is so small relative to these data points that it looks just flat. It looks like it doesn't matter. This is actually a really interesting result, because it means there's something wrong with our theory. As an experimentally trained physicist, right, nature is the ultimate judge of whether a theory is correct or not. And here we see the results of our theory don't match nature. We need something else. There's something our theory is not including. There's something our model doesn't capture. Okay, because this is a course about quantum computing and sort of quantum stuff more broadly, maybe we're missing the fact that these electrons are quantum, these excitons are quantum objects. And so maybe we need to model that quantum behavior. So maybe this explains the difference. Maybe we can update our random walk to include the fact that excitons have some quantum aspects, and that could explain the difference. Okay, so let's consider a quantum random walk. Now, the setup for the problem is going to be the same, right? None of the players have changed. We still have our excitons, we still have our pigment molecules, we still have a reaction center. But quantum effects are going to change how the exciton moves and interacts with the reaction center. So we can think of light hitting a pigment molecule, creating a discrete exciton, just as we did before. But then the exciton starts moving in a superposition, like waves rippling outward in this case. And what I want you to think of is, you can think of remember the two-slit experiment, where our photon or our electron or our quantum object would travel through both paths at the same time? Okay, now you can think of the exciton traveling along all the different paths between the pigment molecule that was created in the reaction center at the same time in a superposition. Okay, So that's kind of complicated to simulate, but we're going to sort of walk through some structure. Okay, so we place the reaction center at some particular coordinate. Okay, then we create a state vector. And so that position states equals NP zeros with complex. That gives us a state vector of length 300. So there are 300 places where our exciton could be. And we turn the first place into 1. So everything else is a 0. The first position is a 1. That means our quantum exciton is located at the first pigment molecule. Okay, so I want you to think about the state vector being the probability of the amplitude of the electron or the exciton being at a particular location. And we initialize it such that the exciton is at the first location. Okay, we initialize our number of steps at 0. And now this coin state is this general idea. What this means is that we put everything into a superposition of moving left and right. And so that's a way of capturing, the randomness of moving left or right. Okay, and so this particular line, right, serves the role of telling us when the electron has or the exciton has found the reaction center. And so we look at the probability amplitude of the wave vector representing the exciton at the reaction center. And we use Born's rule to figure out what the probability of it is being there. And we say, if that's less than some random number, we execute this while loop. And this particular while loop puts the exciton in an equal superposition of having moved left and right at the same time. So wherever it is, we kind of take all those probabilities and we move them left and right at the same time. And then this code, using that coin state, right, helps us interfere the left and right states. So that quantum interference is important because that interference is going to change the way we think about the exciton having moved through the pigment molecules. Finally, we've got the normalization step, which, because computers are not perfectly precise, right, you could build up, rounding errors that ruin your normalization and then make the calculations no longer valid. Then you increment your steps and you print out the number of steps. So this is this is relatively complicated code. Okay, so if it's not immediately clear to you, that's okay. What I want you to think about is just now we're simulating, right? We're simulating our exciton as a quantum object. We're allowing it to exist in a superposition of states. And then we're allowing it moving left or right to happen at the same time. And not only happen at the same time, but to interfere and create a change in the way it moves through these pigment molecules that is inherently quantum. Okay, so now that we've got this inherently quantum object, right, we have the exciton's probability distribution to consider. And so now this is an example of, let's say, the probability found for the state vector of the exciton being in a particular position. And so this exciton has a maximum probability of being found at the reaction center. which was 4. Right? This distribution gets more interesting the longer the exciton needs to search. So let's now place the starting position of the exciton and the reaction center farther away. Well, now that's the probability of the exciton's location after we allow the simulation to run. If we put it even farther away, we get an even like denser set of spikes. And you can think of this exciton's wave function as like spreading out, where the peak moves towards the reaction center, but has a spiky interference pattern. Note that like you don't have much of a probability of the electron being far away from the reaction center right after at the end of the simulation. Right? There's basically no probability of the electron being in position 60 or even being in position 1. It starts to peak around where the reaction center is. Okay, so let's find the typical number of steps for a range of reaction center distances. So that plot we took previously, let's see what it looks like when we include these quantum effects. Now, if you can remember, right, remember back to our classical simulation, we needed thousands of steps. Now here you need tens of steps. How does that line up with reality? Well, our experimentally realistic values line up much better with our quantum random walk. So our quantum random walk is a better description. It's a better theory of how photosynthesis works. Our quantum random walk is much, much faster. Right? So you see our classical random walk values you need thousands of steps. Quantum random walk, you need tens of steps. We can understand that speed up using big O notation, right? So a classical random walk scales, right? The number of steps you need to take scales as the square of the distance from where you want to be. Our quantum random walk scales linearly. Now, my hope is that this looks kind of familiar to you, right? This is a quadratic speed up. And that may sound familiar to you because this exciton uses superposition and interference to find the reaction center more quickly. Find the reaction center, right? This is an unstructured search. It's almost like Grover's algorithm. The exciton is looking for the reaction center and it finds it. It's an unstructured search. It doesn't know where it is. And it finds it more quickly by exploring all these paths together at the same time. And you get a quadratic speed up over what you might expect. Okay. Let's see. I don't see any questions hanging out in the Q&A right now. But why don't we go ahead and pause for our break? Because I know we've gone through a lot of stuff just now. So let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at maybe 27 minutes past the hour, and we'll finish up with quantum computing used to simulate quantum systems. Okay. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Let's finish up the last part of our lecture before we have our discussion of final projects. So we're going to talk about using quantum computers for simulations. So we started the lecture and opened that, there are a few reasons you might want to simulate quantum computers, and they include that, quantum hardware can be expensive and hard to access. You may want to be developing new things. There are all sorts of reasons you might want to do quantum simulations. And we talked about quantum simulation on a classical computer and some reasons why that might be challenging. Let's talk about quantum simulations on quantum computers now. So how do we use quantum computing to simulate physics? Well, there's so much popular culture that's oriented around this idea you see at the right-hand side, where you've got a absolutely world-staggeringly brilliant person sitting in a Swiss patent office with a chalkboard, and he produces equations that describe the universe, right? Frankly, that's not really how physics is done these days. You still have these crazy intelligent people, but it's a interaction between simulation and experiment and theory that takes lots and lots of people and lots of computers. Right. The physics problems of the day are often too complicated to be calculated by hand. There's a joke that a physicist is going to simulate a chicken. He's going to write down an equation for a chicken, right? And he says, all right, first we're going to consider just a spherical chicken in a vacuum, because the equations for an actual chicken are too complicated. And so if you look at, equations of physics problems today, when you want to include all the effects that makes them relevant to a real world problem, they get super calculated, right? So we have computers that help us handle these complex systems. So no shade to Einstein, but like that's not really how science happens as much anymore. So what you got there, the picture's a really pretty picture. Those are particle pathways, right? These modern physics problems I'm talking about, or that we're talking about, can involve billions of particles interacting with each other millions of times per second. So the Large Hadron Collider, right, in Europe at CERN, right, the European Center for Nuclear Research, slams lots of particles together and see what comes out. And it's how we study particle physics, how we study the basic rules of reality, right? You need 1.5 times 10 to the 18 bytes of storage to deal with that. Okay, that's way too much for anybody to handle by hand. And because we're dealing with particles, they're inherently quantum, right? So if we could get a handle on quantum simulations for this, right? Well, the idea is that maybe quantum computing can simulate these complex problems more efficiently, or they can allow us to analyze our data or find results in a more efficient way. So I come to you with this idea that quantum computers offer some advantages for simulation. There's this idea of quantum parallelism, right? And it's not quite exactly parallelism, but what I want you to think about is the reason we spent so much time talking about excitons in plants is that the exciton is not just taking a linear pathway from A to B. It's not even just linearly considering, do I move left or right? The exciton moves across every pathway at the same time. And that's why we might say it moves across them in parallel. So this idea of quantum parallelism allows quantum computers to simulate multiple possibilities simultaneously. And so now you can remember when we talked about, if you add a single qubit to a quantum system, you have to double the number of states. Well, now I want you to think about it going backwards, right? Another qubit cuts in half the number of simulation or calculations you have to do relative to classical computing. So that, and I'm sort of speaking tongue in cheek there, it's not exactly that, but that's what I want you to think about, right? That's sort of where the benefit of quantum simulation comes from. And over there is everybody's favorite physicist, right? Richard Feynman. And he says, and Richard Feynman actually thought about quantum. Richard Feynman thought about a lot of stuff, actually. But he says nature isn't classical. If you want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. And that's sort of what we're seeking to do. So there might be several different areas where quantum computing can have a major impact. Quantum chemistry is a big one, and it's my favorite. And we'll talk about quantum chemistry a little bit more. But it's the idea that we're going to treat our molecules not just as classical systems, but as quantum systems. And so we're going to consider electron energy levels and where they hang out as coming from quantum interactions. Okay, there's also high energy physics, which we talked about, right? If I want to simulate a quark gluon plasma that was present at the beginning of the universe, it might be better to do that in a system that's inherently quantum than one that's classical. And quantum field theory is one of sort of the basic theories of reality. And it has a lot of implications for how we understand the universe. And so simulations we could do for quantum field theoretic calculations would be really useful in testing these theories. Okay, so each of these has a unique set of challenges that make simulation on classical computers hard. And so if we could do quantum computing that would allow us to simulate in these disparate but connected applications, then maybe we could overcome those challenges. Okay, so let's talk a bit about quantum chemistry. Because in my opinion, I really love this for like materials and drug design, all that kind of stuff, protein folding. Okay. Imagine that we can simulate molecules, right, which are quantum things, right, because they're tiny, with quantum computation. So we can accurately simulate the quantum parts of those interactions. And so we're not limited to our classical computations, which, as we've seen with our random walk for photosynthesis, produce results that just don't agree with reality, right? So some potential use cases: battery design. Batteries are huge if we want to move to, say, electrified cars. If we want to think about home batteries like a Tesla Powerwall or whatever that can help you deal with losing power. All right, battery design is great, and there are a lot of questions about what are the best materials to make batteries. How high can we drive the energy density? How much can we extend the cycles that the batteries can go through? Right, very rich field for simulation. Carbon capture. Could we design an efficient material that just sucks carbon out of the air? Right, that would be great for dealing with climate change. Green fuel sources, right? What if we could figure out some kind of process that makes biodiesel more efficient? Right? What if we could optimize our design of a solar cell? These things would all benefit from sort of molecular simulations that come from quantum chemistry. So how do we use molecular simulations to accomplish this? Why are molecular simulations useful or interesting? Well, let's think about molecular structure. And so at the right, that's a diagram of a protein, right? The little curls there are alpha helices, and then you've got some active region that's highlighted there. Proteins are the way that life does chemistry. I used to, there's a joke that plants are the most amazing chemists in the world, because think about the rich variety of molecules they produce, right? And they do that using these complicated proteins or enzymes. And so a key part of chemistry is understanding molecules and how they bond to each other. So in the active site of a particular enzyme, you're going to have some very important, interesting bonding interactions that go on that enable the chemistry, right? And so if you understand the exact structure of a molecule, you can figure out how it's bonding. You can figure out the mechanism of its action and the implications of that mechanism going forward. Alternatively, like you might be able to go backwards or to use the structure of a molecule to figure out how to predict some things about it, right? So maybe you want a full map of how the molecule is arranged, or maybe you want to know how the molecule atoms in the molecule tend to bond, or maybe you want to know how the molecule will behave with other molecules, right? So if we understand the structure, if we can simulate the structure, if we can map out the energy levels, if we can map out the interactions between molecules, right, that's very powerful. So there's this interplay between composition and structure, right? What atoms is it made of and how are the atoms arranged? Those are the composition and structure. And both of those things are going to give rise to properties and functions, right? What can it do? So if I have lithium arranged in a particular structure, that's going to help me build a battery. Or maybe if I have some light emitting diodes, right, that I've arranged, that can make a TV. Now, however, efficient molecular simulation is going to let us go backwards. What do you want it to do? Well, if you can simulate it efficiently, then you can figure out, okay, what atom should it be made of and how should I put them together? And so we could use quantum computers to simulate the structures of molecules and thereby figure out, if I have some goal I want, what material should I pick and how should I arrange them? So if we want to find the structure of a molecule, right, we want to figure out the structure of a molecule, that's about identifying the most stable minimum energy arrangement of its atoms. Okay, that's a lot of words to mean like, where's the molecule most comfortable? If you think about where your body is most comfortable, right? If I take my arms and I twist them in a weird way behind my back, that's not a low energy configuration. I'm having to expend energy to do that. However, I'm just sitting here naturally in my chair talking to you. That's a much more stable configuration. And we find that nature always seeks the lowest energy arrangement. And so, how do we calculate the lowest energy arrangement of a molecule? Well, we calculate all the energies possible, and then we find the lowest energy one. Now, maybe this sounds familiar to you, but it turns out that this is a constrained optimization problem, right? You have some constraints around the atoms, how they're connected to each other, and then you want to find the arrangement of the atoms relative to each other that minimizes the energy. Classically, that's really inefficient. One of the fascinating things to me is one of the few things we can calculate exactly are the energy levels of a hydrogen atom. But when you move to helium, there's no exact solution. You have to start introducing corrections to your calculation. And that's just finding the energy levels in an atom. If I want to move to a whole molecule, okay, that gets much more complicated. And now think about moving from ozone and oxygen to something like caffeine or these really complicated biological molecules that have, that are coordinated metal active, have active sites that have coordinated metals in them, right? That's really complicated. So even though these molecules are simple, the calculations are so complicated. When you make them more complicated molecules, it gets even worse. The bigger the molecule is, you're going to exponentially increase the number of possible solutions, right? And so that efficiency of a quantum simulation becomes really attractive. Okay, so let's consider hemoglobin. And I think hemoglobin was one of the first structures of, a protein that was actually completely understood. And it took, I think, like a couple of decades of work. How many atoms do you think this hemoglobin molecule has? Okay. Don't let the colors of the spirals, right, sort of mislead you. Even though that structure, it looks complicated, but it doesn't look crazy, right? Hemoglobin has over 10,000 atoms. That's not 10,000 electrons. That's 10,000 atoms. Almost 20 billion possible combinations of how I can arrange these things together, right? Each calculation is going to be pretty intensive because you have to think about the interactions between all these different atoms. So one of those 20 billions is going to be tough to calculate. So a classical computer takes a very long time to find the lowest energy state. This is the protein folding problem, right? If I have a protein consists of all these amino acid subunits that are connected together in what's called the primary structure of a protein. But predicting, you might know the primary structure of a protein. There are ways to get that in the lab. Understanding the actual physical 3D structure of a protein from its primary structure is a really hard problem. And we sometimes ask ourselves, like, how does the protein even do it? Right? Because you've got 20 billion different possible combinations that the configuration the protein's exploring. How does it ever end up folding the right way? Well, it turns out there's some energetic things that help it do that. But think about what's happening in terms of energies, right? So on the left, you have all these different possible structures. So the protein and its primary structure, the chain of amino acids, right, is randomly bouncing around and interacting because it's in a system that's at some non-zero temperature, right? And each of those particular configurations has an energy, and it's going to seek out the lowest one. So the black dot on the right-hand side is the total energy of a particular configuration that the protein is exploring. And so you're going to move through, as you simulate, right? You're going to move through all of these different configurations. You're going to try your best to solve this constrained optimization problem and maybe eventually end up at the lowest energy state. But the quantum computer, right? The quantum computer, we can look at a superposition of, notionally, we could look at a superposition of structures and investigate them all simultaneously in some sense. And that would dramatically improve our ability to predict the structure of a protein, say, from its primary structure of amino acids. And so now imagine that instead of it taking a ridiculously long time to figure out the effect of a change of an amino acid on a protein structure, you can do it efficiently. I mean, that has amazing implications for drug design. So yeah, if we could simulate molecular structures, maybe we could create compounds that prevent viruses from binding to human cells. Okay. If we could accurately model protein structure, we can predict what compounds disrupt the binding process more quickly. And so instead of just parallel testing a whole bunch of random compounds, right, in an experimental way, maybe we can be more thoughtful in the front end, and we can say, given the simulations we've run, we can test just a smaller subset. Okay, creating new drugs and improving them. So many drugs that we use for health or for addressing illness are about the interactions of proteins. And so if we can simulate proteins accurately, right, maybe it'll be cheaper and easier to create new drugs that address issues. Maybe we don't have to randomly notice in a clinical trial that something has a particular effect that we want. Maybe we can target it. Okay, so quantum chemistry happens to be like, if you ask me, Dr. Derek, where do you think the cool part of quantum computing is going to be? I think it's probably quantum chemistry. But don't, that is my particular opinion. There are also other applications, right? Like high energy physics. So I'm always fascinated by like why the universe the way it is, or why the universe is the way it is. And on the right, you see this timeline of the history of the universe, where there's a big bang, there's an inflationary period, then there's a cooling off, and we've got the observable universe we see today. It might not seem like it, but high energy physics or particle physics is contributes to that question, right? If we understand how the most elementary building blocks of matter interact, then up from that theory, we can predict sort of nature, why it is the way it is. We can understand how matter, energy, radiation all came into existence and why the universe looks how it does now. These high energy physics problems, though, as you might imagine, can include lots of interactions between quantum particles. So if we could simulate the behavior of these interactions between elementary particles, there's a lot of things we could do. The formation of matter is actually really interesting. Like the matter you think about today, the idea of hydrogen was not present in the beginning of the universe. It was just a really intense soup of tiny elementary particles. So even the simplest stuff didn't come around until, don't quote me on this, I think 300,000 years is the end of the radiative era. So at least for the first 300,000 years, there were no atoms in the universe. And so thinking about how matter is formed, right, is a really interesting problem, and maybe quantum simulations could help with that. Particle collisions, right? Again, we have one of those diagrams there that is about scattering events or collision events in a particle accelerator, right? If we could somehow encode those quantum interactions into a quantum computer, we could simulate them more efficiently. Finally, inside the atom, right? If you want to think about nuclear structure, if you want to think about interactions between gluons and quarks and quantum chromodynamics, right? That's some really intense stuff. And some additional computing power, some additional efficiency would help with that. Like one of the really interesting things, this is kind of an aside, but neutron stars, right? Neutron stars are almost like big, giant nuclei. They're these stellar objects that the gravity is so strong that it's crushed all of the material into a bunch of neutrons. So you've pressed so hard on the atoms that the electrons almost fall into the nucleus and bind to the protons and make neutrons, right? There's actually really interesting structure that occurs there that's really hard to simulate, because now you have this soup of neutrons that's at this really macroscopic scale. And so understanding the interactions between fundamental particles would be really useful. Okay, so how can we use simulation to accomplish these things? Well, if we want to simulate high energy physics on classical computers, right, we have that scaling problem we run into, right? The more particles you add, it's almost like you double the number of states. Okay, the number of interactions between the particles. So if you have particles interacting with each other, that also hurts your scaling. That makes it really hard to scale. And finally, like the quantum nature just inherently is hard to represent accurately. And so quantum computers can offer some support here. We can explore the sort of configurations exponentially faster than classical quantum computers in the best cases, right? So there's that quantum speed up we talk about, because we're doing everything at once instead of having to go piece by piece. Because we have this resource of entanglement that's present in quantum computers, the interactions become much more efficient to simulate. Now, instead of needing to capture the entanglement between things in some restricted set of states, I automatically have this resource of entanglement that I can use in my quantum computer. And finally, there's more accurate representation. Okay, so particle interactions are also another kind of thing that we might want to simulate. If you think about the interactions, the scattering events that happen in a particle accelerator, the results are random, right? You might, if you think about the data that comes out of, a large hadron collider, it's actually probabilities. It's, you notice some change in the probability, some unexpected excess number of events. And so a good simulation is going to inherently model these probabilistic aspects of particles that have this quantum randomness. And it's kind of like a Monte Carlo simulation, right? There's a Monte Carlo sort of type aspect to it. Okay, applications of high energy physics. New energy sources like nuclear fusion. Okay, so maybe when we understand the behavior of particles, right, we'll be able to do nuclear fusion better. That's an idea. One of the things that, if you think about the way hemoglobin structure was identified, it was through X-ray crystallography. And so improvements in accelerators can give you improvements in technology that can help you map protein structures, develop new drugs, diagnoses, treatments, like all these kind of things can come out of better simulations for high energy physics. However, the physicist in me at heart says it would just be cool to know how the universe works. And if quantum computers help with that, that's enough for me. QFT, quantum field theory. Okay, so quantum field theory is another area that it would be cool to simulate. QFT is a field of physics, and I don't want to necessarily combines quantum, or yeah, it does combine, Einstein's special relativity in quantum mechanics, not general. But yeah, QFT allows us to combine our theories of the universe into something that represents things better. And the diagram you see at the right is this inherently quantum field theoretic thing that says that the vacuum, right, empty space, is not actually empty. It's seething with these virtual particles that pop in and out of existence. And by modeling QFT, right, we think we can better understand fundamental physical forces in particles. QFT kind of underlies the standard model of particle physics, which is our best theory of the universe to date. And so how can we simulate or use quantum computers to simulate QFT? Well, we got to model these interactions of quantum particles with each other, right? And so as we saw in our high energy physics application, right, simulating QFT is something classical computers are going to struggle with. It's going to take a lot of variables and a lot of computing power. However, our quantum computers, right, they simulate quantum particles very naturally. And so the natural language of a quantum computer is really going to support a quantum field theory calculation. And so you can move from these particles interacting to like wave functions that you can actually extract predictions from. Okay, so why do we care about simulating QFT? Well, this is something I think about a lot: quantum gravity. So as I mentioned, QFT combines, it can combine quantum mechanics and special relativity. It can't handle general relativity, though. And so the holy grail of theoretical physics is a grand unified theory, or theory of quantum gravity, that takes QFT and merges it with general relativity, right? And so if we could simulate QFT better, then maybe we'd have an approach to understand, or start understanding, or make quantum gravitational predictions, right? This is what every theoretical physicist dreams about. The standard model is our current best theory of physics, right? It explains all the fundamental forces except gravity, all the particles we see in the universe. It's really a triumph of physics that we're able to understand as much as we do in the standard model. The standard model is inherently quantum field theoretic. So the better we can simulate that, the better we can approach our understanding of the universe. Okay, so let's have a quick lesson recap before I hand it over to for a discussion on our capstone projects. Okay, so our learning objectives want to recognize that you can simulate quantum computing with classical methods, and there are reasons you might want to do that. And each of those methods has their own strengths and weaknesses, right? Stake vector simulations are exact, but they scale really poorly. Monte Carlo simulations aren't exact, they're inherently random, but you need to worry about sample sizes. Tensor networks are really efficient, but they're complicated and don't handle entanglement. And discrete event simulations, sort of have some of these trade-offs that all the other ones have. Okay, so each of these options has their own set of trade-offs. There's no such thing as a free lunch. You don't get anything for free, but you can put them together in interesting and useful ways depending on the problem you're trying to handle. And our other learning objective was that recognizing quantum computers can simulate quantum systems better than classical systems, right? You get this sort of exponential advantage because a quantum computer can in some ways test all of these different ideas in parallel when a classical computer can only test them in series. So you can accurately track interactions, you can explore multiple scenarios simultaneously, and you can accurately represent quantum particles. Okay, so with that, maybe I will turn things over for a discussion of your capstone projects.
Amazing. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Derek, for that awesome lecture. But it is time to talk about the long-awaited capstone projects. I know a lot of you are really excited about this, and we put a lot of time and effort into making sure that this is a really straightforward process for you. So let me go ahead and, oh, thank you so much. That's so helpful. Awesome. The attendance code will be given when I am done with this part of the lecture. So just hold on for a moment and we'll get back up. Awesome. So we will have 3 types of project options for you. We'll have one encryption in Python, another option, which is an infographic or poster, and a third, which is a letter to a politician. So for these projects, the final project submission will be worth 10 points, and it will be pass or fail, and it will fall into the homework section of your grade. So just be aware of the weight that will be assigned with that. All final projects will be due on April, I believe, 21st. Don't quote me on that. We'll have it on the next slide. In your very first project check-in, which will be due on April 7th, you'll have the option to choose one of those 3 project options that I just spoke about on the last slide. And you'll have the option to express your interest in joining our project showcase on the 28th. So basically, if you are interested in that, the opportunity is such as, basically you'll submit your project at the very end of the due date. And if you're interested in presenting to the entire class, our panel will look over it. And then our top scoring projects will be asked to join the showcase and present for the entire class on the 28th. We'll have a panel of special guest judges, so it should be really fun. If you're interested in that, make sure to indicate it in that very first project check-in. Awesome. And again, that project showcase is going to be a community event. We encourage you to share the lecture link on the 28th with your friends, your family, anyone who might be interested in seeing on what you've been working on all year. Awesome. So as I was speaking about, here are some of our deadlines. Our very first project check-in is due on April 7th. Your second one will be due on April 14th. And then your final submission, oh, I was right on that one, will be due on April 21st. Keep that in mind. We do have some indications of lecture and lab cadences right here on the left. Please do note that we will not be having lecture on March 31st due to Easter Sunday. And then as well as no lecture on April 14th. So just keep that in mind. This will be outlined in the project overview, which if you look up Canvas, it has been posted. We'll have this schedule and more information there. But yeah, let's get into the project types. So the first one we have is encryption in Python. Students will write a code to encrypt and decrypt a message of their choice using a key created through QKD. You will analyze your work and write a short paper discussing the steps of encrypting and decrypting your data, as well as what effects an eavesdropper will have on the success of transmitting this encrypted data. So this project does require coding, and it's really great for someone who enjoys the coding aspect of this course and enjoys encryption and decryption, as well as quantum networking. Our next project type is the infographic or poster. So this project does not, or it does require coding. It does require coding. And you'll create an infographic or poster that effectively and creatively communicates the detailed workings of a specific quantum algorithm or protocol. The challenge here lies in making a technical topic easy to understand for a general audience. So someone who, haven't been taking an introduction to quantum computing for a year. So this project will require coding, and it's really good for those people who are interested in the intersection of quantum technologies, design, and art. So keep that in mind. And then our very third one is our only project. Oh, yes, this is what an infographic would look like. So again, combining information and visuals to make a holistic example of what a process looks like. Awesome. And our very last one is a letter to a politician. This is our only project that does not include any coding. So the goal of this is to address a critical or ethical issue related to quantum computing. And it's an exercise in advocating for awareness or change and presenting complex issues in an accessible and persuasive manner. This format allows you to directly address those in positions of power to affect change, emphasizing the importance of informed policymaking in the field of quantum. So like I said, this is the only project that does not require any coding, and it's for students who are passionate about policy and ethics and technology and enjoy writing. Yeah, awesome. So you'll see this in the project overview that has been posted to the modules page of Canvas. We even do have like a template for you to write this letter to a politician on. So yeah, there's a lot of resources there. And I think this one would also just be a really fun one. All right, so to close out, if you do have questions, I will answer a few that I saw in the chat just now. But before asking questions, I do encourage you to go to Canvas and check out that project overview, because all the information that you'll be asking about will be presented there. So the questions that I am seeing in the Q&A and chat that I will be answering are ones that I know are not in the project overview, okay? Awesome, so I do see, oh yes, and our lecture attendance code, please input that now. We'll have this up on the screen as I answer some quick questions. So could you do some combination of these three prompts? No, you have to choose one of these three options. We are not allowing combinations. All right. I'm seeing attendance code. Are we going to choose? Yes, so in your very first, the question is right here in the Q&A, are we going to choose some of these topics for our final project? So you're not necessarily going over topics, you're doing one of those three project types that I just mentioned. And in the very first project check-in, which will be due on April 7th, you will indicate what type of project you would like to do. The encryption project, the infograph/poster project, or the letter to a politician project. And these will be individual projects, as someone asked in the Q&A. We will not be allowing you to work in groups for this. It's just, we have thousands of students in this course, so it's a little bit too much for us to handle with groups. And I do see someone in the chat asked us how much of our grade will this be worth? It will be worth 10 points in the homework category. And someone asked, can we research and write about algorithms that we didn't learn about in this course? I'm going to assume yes, but I will double check. Awesome. I think that is all the time that we have today. Thank you all for joining. I hope you had a great spring break. Thank you so much, Dr. Derek, for leading us today, and Sanskriti for helping us with questions. But I think we're going to log off. Have a great rest of your week. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Talk to you all soon.